Right, so we're going to start by cutting 3 lengths of 35 centimeter long wire. Now I've used square 0.8 millimeter wire for this, but you can also use round if you don't have square. It'll work just as well. It's just that the square sits easier when you are creating frames like this, but as I said, round works just as well. So we need to create a loop right in the middle of one of the wires, and this is going to be used to suspend the bead or whatever you want to suspend from it. It's just a way of actually creating a little loop at the bottom for things to dangle off your pendant. So just use your round nose pliers, and that's what it looks like. Next, bring in the other wires that we've cut and line them up, so one on each side so that the loop is actually in the center, and bring in your 0.8 millimeter half round. Now again, if you don't have half round, you can use 0.6 millimeter wire perhaps to do the winding like that, or you can just create a weave around the 3 wires at the bottom with some 0.4 millimeter wires. So there are several options, that you can then use alternatives if you don't have the materials available. So 0.4 would work if you're weaving, or 0.6 or 8 if you are doing it like this. So just take your time when winding the wires around, and then we're going to trim off. Just be sure that when you cut the wires, the cut ends are sitting flush on the inside. That'll prevent snagging on clothing when you're wearing the piece later. So next we're going to bend the wires in a V shape, so be sure to be as close to the bottom as possible, and then take your bead and have a look and see where the bead actually sits in that V, and see if you're happy with the space. You can adjust it according to how you like it. So that's good for me. So I'm going to keep that spacing, and the next I'm going to shape the wires to go around the bead. Now you could use a round object if you prefer to do it that way. I always use my hands. I prefer to manipulate the wire this way, but everybody has their own methods. So just shape it until you're satisfied with the fit. Take my bead, and it should be wedged securely in the middle like so, so that the bead is then sitting securely once you bend the wires in place. Next we need to bend the top wires at a sort of 90-degree angle so that they sit parallel to each other, and this is going to be the section where we're going to create the veil. So we're going to tie these to each other with a piece of 25 centimeter 0.8 mil half round wire. Now again, if you don't have your half round, you could use round wire as well. Again, 0.6 or 0.8 to keep with the same gauge. Just see what you prefer, but it's not necessary that you use the half round. It just looks really nice. I like using it, and it's easy to work with. So we're going to wrap this a couple of times around all of the wires like so, and once around the side at the bottom to anchor it in place. And next we separate out the 6 wires at the top, so keep the 2 at the front for the bail, and then 2 on each side, which some of which we're going to be using for decorations, and some we're going to be trimming off. You can keep them to add more decors. I've kept this pendant fairly simple, so it's entirely up to you. You can just follow the pattern and then do your own thing as well. So again, take your half round wire and very carefully wrap this around the front 2 wires, which are going to be our bail. So just take your time and do it slowly. The neater you work, the better the end result. So this is about, if you 25 centimeters gives you roughly about 2 centimeters worth of bail. If you want a longer bail, a bigger bail, you can use more wire. So next we just need to shape this into the bail. Again, you can use a bail making pliers for that. I again use my hands just to shape the bail in place like so, and feed the 2 legs coming out of the bail, feed that through the pendant from back to front, and we're going to wrap the 2 legs that are coming through the front around each side once, and that's enough to anchor it in place. This is basically just to keep the bale in place and anchor it so that everything is nice and sturdy. Now, sometimes you need to manipulate the wire a bit to sit properly. Just take your time with it, and it will fall into place. So just form the wires around the base, and as I said, one wrap is enough. So I'm bringing this through just one more time and pulling this. Now you can see I'm fighting the wire a little bit here. I have used 1mm wire for the pendant, which I found was a little bit too difficult to work with personally. That's why I think 0.8mm wire is much better for this project, as it's much easier to work with. So next we're going to check the bead, and the fit is great, so I'm quite happy with that. And I'm going to bend in the bottom of the pendant and to create the actual cradle for the pendant. Now for that I'm going to bring in a pair of flat-nosed pliers, like so, because then the actual size of the bend is precisely the same every time. When you're using chain nose pliers, you have to kind of guess where you put the plier the last time. So if you have something like that, that's really helpful to make sure you gauge the sizing where you put the bend, and I find these flat nose pliers perfect for that. We're going to do the back now as well. Bend them in, and just a little bit, because obviously we need to bring the bead in before you bend it over the stone. So bend it a little bit, and once you have fitted your bead, you can then bend everything over the stone. Now I've used an undrilled bead here, but you could obviously use one that has a hole, so you can just hide it. So it's entirely up to you what you have available, so it doesn't necessarily have to be an undrilled bead. Now next we're going to use one of the wires that came out of the bale, so from the back, and I'm going to use this as a decor. You could trim it off, but I've used this particular one as a decor to go around the front as a little twirl on top of the bale. So I'm just shaping it now. Use your round nose pliers for that, and then what I find quite helpful is cut the straight bit off when you're creating twirls. That way when you've finished with your twirls, they look perfectly round and don't have that sort of square section right at the front, which can look quite untidy sometimes. So I like to cut that off. So I'm shaping it here, and next you kind of lay it against the bale and decide where you'd like it to sit. Press it into place. Next, take one of the wires on the right hand side here and fold it over and up, and this is to create a swirl. And this one is going to go back behind the bale, so it's going upwards rather than downwards, just to create a little bit of detail on the bale itself. So just shape as you go along until you're satisfied with the results. And next attach the wire to the bale. This wire is going to be trimmed off later on. I tend to keep a lot of my wires in place and don't cut them off, just in case I decide later on I want to do something different with it. So quite often my pieces look like an octopus, unlike some other people that I know that work much neater and tidier than myself. I just have a chaotic style. And the next step here is to use one of the wires from the right, and we're going to go round the front to create a little sweep. Be sure to leave a little funnel shaped section. This is where the beads are going to sit later on, the copper beads or whatever else you have available. You can also use the gemstone rounds if you have those, or whatever else you have that you can feed onto a 0.4mm wire. So this wire gets bent around the frame just very gently, and we're going to pull that tight, and this will then wedge it in place. I tend to square wire sometimes can be tricky to work with, because you need to make sure it stays straight at all times. The slightest twist and it looks unsightly, so you need to make sure it keeps straight. I keep straightening it with my fingers, which also warms it and makes it then more malleable to work with. So creating another twirl, and this design again is a very sort of organic design, because obviously your twirls will be really different from mine, so it'll be a different look to it, which is quite nice about these designs, because no two pieces will actually look exactly the same. So twirl the square wire around itself, and this is where the square wire is actually a lot nicer than the round, because it has a lot more surface area, and I think it looks quite nice when you put them in designs like this. But every type of wire has its own merits, and you know, everybody has different preference too, so it's entirely up to you. So just keep manipulating it and shaping it until you're satisfied with the result, and then just kind of shape it over the stone. And then remember to cut that straight little first section off when you create the loop at first. Right, so next we need to trim off all the excess wires. As I said earlier, you can still reuse them and add more detail if you wanted to. As I said, I wanted to keep it fairly simple, so this is what my version looks like. So next we're going to add in our accent beads. So for that I'm just bringing in another 0.4 millimeter piece of wire. You could use 0.6 for added strength, which will also anchor much easier to the frame, and won't come undone if you prefer to use that. So again, that's up to you, or depending on what materials you have available. So just whichever you use, make sure you anchor them properly, because obviously you don't want the beads to fall off when you're wearing the piece. So be sure to anchor the wire so that it runs coming from one end and lays parallel with the square wire that we're using as a channel, so that they sit quite flush coming in from the one side. Once you're satisfied with the way it looks, just come in from the end and make sure you anchor them in place again, so that, as I said, they are sturdy and it doesn't come undone in case it gets hooked on something. And trim off the wires. That's that. Next we're going to attach the little swirl at the bottom, because what tends to happen when you have swirls like that, if you're wearing them, they can quite easily get caught in your clothing. So I find it important when you are wearing your pieces or selling them on, you want to make sure that everything stays as it is intended to, so attach it to the frame. And lastly, take your head pin and attach a little bead to it, or whatever accent you decide looks best on your piece. Little rosary link is all you need, and later on a jump ring to attach to the piece itself. And that's super easy, and that's the pendant all done. Now I've oxidized mine. I haven't shown this in this video, but there is a video on my channel where you can actually have a look and see how the process works. Otherwise, just enjoy the pendant as is. And thank you so much for watching, and hit follow for more tutorials.